All right, well, good evening and welcome to this special committee of the whole on this Tuesday, April 11th. The time is 7 p.m. We have approximately 30 minutes before our city council meeting begins, so I'll keep this concise. But with that said, there's one item on this agenda. I will open up the floor to the audience to address the city council on the matter that's specifically on this evening's agenda, but only after the city council's had the opportunity to discuss any questions, comments, or concerns with the presenter and or staff. I ask that persons wishing to address the city council keep their comments to 5 minutes in length, and it looks like there are no signatures on the sign-in sheet, so that will not be an issue. But moving on from there, we have one item on the agenda, which is covering the Rolling Meadows Transfer Station and transfer station management. Now, most of what you're going to hear this evening is in the packet, but I want to restate a lot of the content for maybe viewers who may have not had the opportunity to read the contents in the packet, but also because I feel the chain of events in the scenario needs to be memorialized and put on the record as a resource in the event that it's needed for citation or reference in the future when decisions and directions may be required. So as you know, the City of Rolling Meadows owns a transfer station, and we contractually outsource the management of that station, and we do so for certain logistical and financial reasons. But in 2020, Waste Management Incorporated, or WMI, and bear with me because there's a lot of abbreviations, so you might get lost in them, but Waste Management, WMI, acquired Advanced Disposal Services, ADS. As part of the acquisition, the U.S. Department of Justice required a divestiture of assets to occur in order for the acquisition to proceed. The DOJ issued a press release on October 23rd of 2020, and it detailed why and how the divestiture was necessary to preserve competition in markets. So naturally, this acquisition was creating some concern for antitrust or monopolizing the market between the merger of these two organizations. And at the time the DOJ ordered the divestiture of assets, ADS was the agent who was contracted to manage our transfer station. Now, the resulting October determination from the DOJ led Advanced Disposal Services to submit a letter roughly 17 days later than the press release to the City of Rolling Meadows on November 9th of 2020. And this was a document titled Request for Consent to Transfer the Lease and Intergovernmental Agreement. Now, this lease transfer was to take our station from ADS and give it to GFL Environmental Inc., or GFL, going forward. The document containing the request was received by then City Manager Barry Crumstock and then Director of Public Works Fred Vogt. They had the oversight of the City of Rolling Meadows Attorney James McCall. The City Manager and the Director, they proceeded to sign the consent to transfer agreement, and at the time there was no council action or communication about allowing the transfer of the lease from ADS to GFL. Nor was the council made aware of any of the extenuating circumstances by the Department of Justice between Waste Management and ADS that set this entire chain of events in motion. Now, the result of city staff signing off on the request for consent to transfer agreement enabled GFL to be the newest official agency that would manage the Rolling Meadows transfer station. Now, GFL and the City of Rolling Meadows were to move forward in a partnership honoring the original contractual obligations that were outlined in the 1996 Transfer Station Host Agreement and all subsequent amendment documents that accompanied that. In September of 2021, roughly 10 months after GFL had received written permission to manage the transfer station, a third party had come up to me and informed me that GFL was no longer the entity managing the Rolling Meadows transfer station. Rather, it was an agency known as Lakeshore Recycling Services, or LRS. LRS had been the agent that took over for GFL and their contractual obligations to manage the transfer station. So needless to say, I followed up with staff internally, who was then Director of Public Works, Rob Horn, and asked him if he was aware of any of this, and his response was no, he wasn't, but he would do some investigating and looking into it. So after a period of investigation, Director Horn did confirm that GFL was no longer managing the transfer station, and in fact, LRS was. Now, as you all know, in January of 2022, we hired City Manager Sabo, and after allowing Manager Sabo to settle into his role, I then filled him in on the events and situations surrounding the transfer station. So by March of 2022, the City Manager, myself, and Director Horn, Public Works, scheduled an in-person meeting with representatives from LRS. Excuse me. We set this meeting so that we could speak with the representatives to understand how and when the change of management had occurred. But during that meeting, we also informed LRS that there were certain quality issues that had been observed as a result of this change in managing agents. And so the meeting concluded, and there were some action items given to LRS. One of the action items was naturally to resolve the quality issues within the operations and cleanliness, and the other was for LRS to provide an accurate timeline of when the change in management officially took place, along with an explanation for why the city was not alerted before or at the time of the change, and why a written request was not submitted permitting this change as our contract stipulates. So in May of 2022, as you also know, the discussion was brought before the City Council in a closed session. It was basically to inform the City Council of the situation comprehensively, but the discussion focused on the change among managing agencies and the host agreement contract as it relates to potential litigation. Now, the host agreement contract specifically states in Section 25 under successors and assigns, this lease shall be binding upon and shall inure to the benefit of the parties hereto and their respective successors and permitted assigns. Neither party may assign this lease in whole or in part without the written consent of the other party. So ultimately, this means that no other agency shall manage the transfer station without written consent or agreement from the city, and the city in turn cannot assign another agent to manage the transfer station without any form of written acknowledgement provided back to the current managing agent in advance of the action. So at this time, and because of what's stated in Section 25 of the host agreement, the city finds LRS to be operating the transfer station without approval to do so in violation of the lease. But it's also important to note the consent agreement lease between GFL, which was the prior legitimate agent who had signed off on the contract, has a duration that lasts until August 20th of 2026. Now I want to take a step back and just broaden the background here on LRS, who is currently owned by Macquarie Asset Management Fund out of Sydney, Australia. In February of 2023, there was a memo, which I had later obtained, announcing that the CEO for LRS, Mr. Alan Hadley, had gone on administrative leave. And if you could just pass that for the council to see. It's the same copy, just different modes of message. And he'd gone on administrative leave, but the memo further stated at the time of Mr. Hanley's leave that his duties were to be assumed by an interim committee of the board. And now it's my belief that there will more than likely be a search to replace the former CEO if he does not return from leave, because I don't foresee the board continuing to perform the CEO's daily duties in perpetuity. But it's important for Rolling Meadows City Council members and staff to be aware of what's happening internally with our contracted service providers so we can better preserve our assets and our interests as it corresponds with the decisions that we make going forward. Now, for a second time, this was information that wasn't provided to us directly by those who are managing our transfer station, or our partners, so to speak. It was delivered to me anonymously in my city mailbox. Now, due to the lack of transparency, and I'm sure that others have difference of opinion on this, but from my seat where I sit, there was a genuine lack of transparency and communication. It would be in our best interest for city staff and the city council to be aware of the contractual obligations for whoever is the current managing entity of our transfer station or any other assets generally. It's imperative for the city to ensure that this specific asset, which we're speaking about tonight, is well managed, it's well maintained, and it's operating at the full potential for the benefit of the taxpayers. Now, I want to take one step back from what I just mentioned regarding the memo, because after reading that memo, I did further asking around or inquiring as to the validity of the administrative leave for the CEO, and I did get feedback, but I want to preface that the feedback I received is rumors at best or speculation, so I don't want any of this to be determined as truth or fact, but I want to share the information with everyone because somewhere in the ubiquity of the information, I believe the narrative of the truth exists, right? And so it was believed that Mr. Hadley is not necessarily on leave, however, he was terminated and escorted from the facility. There were various reasons surrounding that, and again, speculative at best because I wasn't there and I don't know. But the departure of Mr. Hanley, or the leave, is based on the thoughts that there are dwindling profits, or that the hedge fund had bought LRS when the price was low or right, but now the interest rates have spiked since the new year. The party may be over, and this has triggered decision makers of the fund to take these sorts of action. But at the very least, if any of that were to be true, then there is the potential for Macquarie to sell off LRS's subsidiary from its portfolio. And should a sale happen, LRS might find itself under new ownership entirely. But at the very least, if there is a new CEO in Mr. Hanley's stead, then it will definitely be under new executive management. And that new management has the potential to impact operations or impact other aspects, and I think that the City Council should be aware of these things. But ultimately, when I heard this information and I took a step back to review the timeline from 2020, we had 4 different agencies that had a hand in our asset, our transfer station. And, you know, when it comes to partnerships or relationships, there has to be a degree of communication and trust, right? And communication is something that I feel like has been mediocre at best, at least in my chair. Now, communication may have been better for others, but the communication with me as the mayor has been suboptimal. And the second part, when it comes to trust, it's all about interests for each party. And if we look at the interests here, we can see that Waste Management Incorporated, which is headquartered in Houston, Texas, who acquired Advanced Disposal Service, who is headquartered out of Jacksonville, Florida, and GFL, which is a Canadian company out of Vaughan, Ontario, Canada, which handed our transfer station over to LRS, which is owned by Macquarie Asset Management Fund out of Sydney, Australia. Not one of them have a personal interest in the state of Illinois or Rolling Meadows for that matter. They definitely have financial interests given their business dealings, and that's a fact. But since 2020, we've had 4 different entities that have had an active hand in our asset. And in my opinion, I feel like these large corporate machines have been passing our asset around like COVID in order to increase their strategic market reach and their profitability. While, again, I think we settle for lower than optimal value with our city's asset for the taxpayers. Now, ultimately, we should determine the contractual value and define the deal. But as a council manager form of government, we know that our roles are mostly ceremonious, but we do have teeth when it comes to legislative policy and decisions that serve the best interests of the taxpayers or the city and its assets. But for those who will be around should the contract reach its termination limits in August of 2026, I really recommend that those who will be here take a deep dive and understand the refuse and recycling industry, understand the topology of the industry from collection routes, transfer stations, recycling centers, to landfills and everything in between, so you can genuinely recognize the value geographically, logistically, and financially that this asset has for our community. I know we speak about potential shortcomings in our refuse fund, and this is an asset that can be optimized to increase our refuse fund capabilities if necessary. And there is no action items for this evening's conversation. Just wanted to make sure that the council was aware of the series of events and then some considerations. So the first consideration is that I'm requesting in my stead when my absence occurs, because I'll be out of here by May 9th, that you truly be mindful of the history of the managing agents and the way they've operated the city's transfer station. I'd like you to recognize the strategic and financial value this transfer station has and its potential for the future as developments are happening on both our north and south borders. Because ultimately, all of the waste and refuse will have to be transferred before hitting a landfill, and this makes it a critical component on that board game of Monopoly in terms of real estate. And that hopefully the council will contract with an agency that will genuinely be interested in mutual gain and reciprocal benefit as it relates to this asset, to the taxpayers, to the city, and the contractee ultimately. We don't want this to be solely one-sided, but I do believe that we need to have, reciprocal value and reciprocal benefit when it comes to this. It's naturally a strategic asset for the vendors in this space, but it's equally a strategic asset for the city of Rolling Meadows and the taxpayers. So just please be cognizant with that. That's it for my diatribe, but are there any questions, comments, or concerns with this? If not, great. Then I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, Alderman McHale. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Alderman O'Brien. Appreciate that. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say nay. The ayes have it. This meeting is adjourned.